Most students at Westbrook High barely noticed the janitor. She was just there, quiet, unassuming, always early, always cleaning. Her name was Elaine Carter, a 63-year-old black woman who moved silently through the hallways like part of the wallpaper. To them, she was just Miss Elaine, the lady who mopped floors and emptied trash cans. They never imagined she once stood in a college lecture hall solving equations that most of them couldn't begin to understand. Elaine had worked at Westbrook High for nearly 20 years. She came in before the sun rose, her hands rough from years of scrubbing, her knees aching from long shifts. She never complained, she never made a scene, she just did her job, alone and unnoticed. But if you looked closely, you'd see the sharp glint in her eyes. You'd see that every now and then, as she passed a classroom with a complex math problem on the board, her eyes lingered, not in confusion, but with recognition. Long ago, Elaine had another life. She had once been Elaine Foster, a brilliant mathematics student at Carnegie Mellon University. Back then, she dreamed of becoming a professor, of walking into lecture halls with nothing but chalk and ideas, and challenging minds to think deeper. She was good. Not just book smart, but truly gifted. The kind of mind that could see numbers the way an artist sees color. But the world didn't make room for young black women in elite math programs, especially not ones from poor neighborhoods. At Carnegie Mellon, Elaine felt the full weight of what it meant to be different. Professors overlooked her. Classmates excluded her, and no one spoke up when she found hateful notes on her dorm door telling her to go back where you came from. Then came the day everything changed. Her father had an accident, the kind that keeps a man in a hospital bed for months and stacks medical bills to the ceiling. Her family couldn't afford to survive without her. So Elaine packed up her books, said goodbye to her dream, and came home. A few years later, she found work at Westbrook High, not as a teacher but as the janitor. For decades, she kept her past buried deep. What was the point of remembering who she used to be? But life has a funny way of circling back. It happened on a Wednesday morning. Elaine was mopping the floor of Mr. Bennett's AP Calculus classroom. Mr. Bennett, young, cocky, always needing to prove how smart he was, barely acknowledged her, except when he wanted her out of the way. That day, he was in a particularly smug mood. A problem on the board had stumped even his best students, an advanced limit problem with a tricky proof. Elaine glanced at it out of habit. She didn't realize Mr. Bennett had noticed. "You looking at that, Miss Elaine?" he asked, voice loud enough for the whole class to hear. "Why don't you give it a try?" The class snickered. Some laughed out loud. It was meant as a joke, a cheap way to get a laugh at her expense. Just the janitor, after all. Elaine paused. She could have walked away. She had 100 times before. But that morning, maybe it was the way the chalk caught the sunlight, or the way the laughter stung more than usual, something in her said, "Not today." She stepped forward, gently took the chalk from the tray and stared at the problem. The room went silent, and then she started to write, not with hesitation, not with guesses, but with the precision of someone who had done this before. The numbers flowed. The logic was clean. Every step was clear. In less than 5 minutes, the problem was solved. When she turned around, the room was frozen. Mr. Bennett looked like someone had knocked the wind out of him. Students stared with wide eyes. Some confused, some ashamed, all stunned. Elaine looked at him calmly and said, "That's the answer you were looking for." That moment didn't just change how they saw her, it changed how they saw themselves. The chalk squeaked softly as Elaine finished the final line of the solution. No one said a word. Mr. Bennett's arms, once confidently folded across his chest, now hung loosely at his sides. His usual smirk had vanished, replaced with a look of disbelief that bordered on embarrassment. He hadn't expected her to even pick up the chalk, let alone solve the problem his top students had given up on. Just moments earlier, the classroom had been filled with laughter. Elaine had been doing her usual rounds, sweeping under the desks and wiping the chalk dust near the whiteboard, when Mr. Bennet made his offhand comment. He had been joking, of course, trying to flex in front of his students, looking for an easy laugh. "Well now," he'd said, eyeing Elaine with that smug grin, "Miss Elaine, you've been in this classroom enough times. You must have picked up a thing or two by now. Want to show us what you've got?" The class erupted. Some students elbowed each other. A few snorted. One girl actually said out loud, "She probably doesn't even know what it says." Elaine didn't answer at first. She kept sweeping, her eyes locked on the floor. But inside, something twisted, something old and deep and long buried. It wasn't just the insult. It was the way Mr. Bennet had enjoyed the laugh, the way the kids joined in without a second thought. It was the same smirking cruelty she had faced decades ago in college hallways where she was always the exception, never the equal. She straightened slowly. "I'd like to try," she said, her voice calm, almost too quiet for the room. The laughter stopped mid-breath. "Wait, what?" Mr. Bennet asked, raising an eyebrow. "I said I'd like to try." For a beat, he hesitated. His grin wavered, just for a second, but then it returned, broader, more performative now. "All right then, be my guest," he said with a theatrical wave toward the board. "Show us what you've got, Professor." More laughter. But Elaine didn't blink. She walked forward, picked up the chalk, and stared at the equation. It was a differential equation. Tough, but familiar. Like an old song she hadn't heard in years, but still remembered every note of. And slowly, surely, she began to write. One step, then another, then another. Line after line, logic unfolded like poetry. Behind her, the room fell, completely silent. Mr. Bennet stepped closer, his arms crossed again. This time, not in pride, but in quiet tension. A few students leaned forward, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. By the time Elaine finished, her hands were steady, her breathing calm. She turned, placed the chalk gently back in the tray, and said to Mr. Bennet, "That's how it's done." You could have heard a pin drop. The students didn't move. No giggles, no sneers, just wide eyes and slowly forming expressions of shock and confusion. Elaine didn't wait for applause. She didn't smirk or gloat. She simply picked up her mop, nodded politely to the class, and walked out of the room. But she left behind something far louder than any words, a silence that screamed. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a few moments the classroom sat in stunned silence. No one touched their notebooks. No one said a word. Then it began. Softly, like raindrops hitting glass. "Did she really just solve that?" someone whispered. "That was the hardest one he gave us all year," said another. "I thought it was impossible." In the corner, Bennet still stood facing the board, his eyes fixed on Elaine's neat, deliberate handwriting. Every line was flawless, every calculation precise. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't lucky guessing. It was mastery. The laughter that had filled the room just minutes before now echoed back in everyone's minds. But this time, with guilt. A few students sank lower in their seats. A girl named Jessica, who had whispered a cruel joke under her breath when Elaine stepped up, now avoided eye contact with anyone. Bennet finally turned around. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his usual commanding presence. "Well, that was unexpected," he muttered. But no one was looking at him with admiration anymore. No one was impressed. If anything, his voice felt small now, almost irrelevant. A hand slowly rose in the second row. It was Jordan Rivera, a quiet student who rarely spoke unless called on. "Mr. Bennett," he said cautiously, "who is Miss Elaine? Who was she?" That question, innocent but loaded, hung heavy in the room. Bennett hesitated. He didn't know the answer. And that, somehow, was worse than knowing it. He'd worked at the school for 7 years. Elaine had been there longer. And yet, he'd never once wondered who she was beyond her mop and uniform, never asked her a real question, never said more than a hurried "thank you" or "watch out for the chalk dust." He had assumed he knew enough. Janitor, quiet, black, older. That was all he needed to make her the punchline of a joke. But now? Now, he was the joke. That afternoon, whispers spread like wildfire across the halls of Westbrook High. You hear about the janitor in calc. She solved a problem Bennett couldn't even explain. Like, she just walked up and did it. By lunchtime, students were searching online. One junior found an old scanned photo from a 1981 academic conference. Elaine Foster, Carnegie Mellon Mathematics Honors Program. Another uncovered an old thesis abstract published under her name in a forgotten university archive. "Yo," someone said, staring at his screen, "she's legit." Like, really legit. By the end of the day, Miss Elaine, the woman most students hadn't even looked in the eye before, had become the center of a quiet revolution. And Mr. Bennett? He sat alone in his classroom long after the final bell rang, the sun casting long shadows across the empty desks. He stared at the board, the remnants of Elaine's solution still untouched. For the first time in his teaching career, he felt something unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable. Not just embarrassment, but shame. Not because she had outsmarted him, but because he had never once considered she could. The next morning, Mr. Bennett stood outside the janitor's supply closet, hesitating. He'd never been down this hallway before, not really. He knew it existed, of course, but he'd never had a reason to come here. This was her hallway, her world, tucked behind the cafeteria next to the boiler room. Quiet, forgotten. He raised his hand to knock, paused, then finally let his knuckles tap the metal door. Inside, there was the familiar scent of bleach and lemon-scented floor cleaner. Shelves lined with paper towels, spray bottles, old mops leaned in the corner. And there she was, Elaine, tying up a trash bag like it was any other day. She turned when she heard the knock, and for a moment she just looked at him, calm, steady, not surprised, not angry, just waiting. "Miss Elaine," Bennett said, his voice catching. "Do you have a minute?" She nodded once and moved aside, making room in the cramped space. Bennett stepped in. The door clicked shut behind him, and suddenly it felt like the walls were too close, the air too still. He cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." Elaine didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He rubbed the back of his neck, unsure of where to even begin. "What I did yesterday, it was wrong, disrespectful. I thought I was being clever, making a joke. I wasn't. I was cruel, and I'm sorry." Elaine looked at him for a long moment, then finally spoke. "Mr. Bennett," she said gently, "this isn't the first time I've been laughed at. It won't be the last. But yesterday, coming from you, it hurt in a way I didn't expect." Her voice was quiet, but it held weight. Every word landed with the force of years, decades of being overlooked. "I've worked at this school for a long time," she continued. "I've seen kids grow up, graduate, come back and visit. I've seen teachers come and go. But no one ever asked me who I was. They just saw a mop, a uniform, brown skin, gray hair, and assumed the rest. Bennett lowered his head. Elaine stepped past him and gently opened a drawer. She pulled out a thin, faded folder. Inside was a single yellowed newspaper clipping and a photo of a younger version of herself. Bright-eyed, full of promise, standing in front of a chalkboard covered in equations. "This was me," she said, handing it to him. "Before life happened. Before I became someone you could make a joke out of." He looked down at the photo, then back up at her. "I had no idea." "That's the problem," she said softly. "Nobody ever does." Silence stretched between them. "I don't expect you to undo what you did," she added. "But I do expect you to learn from it, and maybe help others learn too." Bennett nodded, his throat tight. "I will," he promised. "Starting today." He offered the folder back to her, but she shook her head. "Keep it," she said. "Maybe it'll remind you that not everyone's story is written on the surface." Bennett held the folder like it was something fragile, something sacred. And in a way, it was. By Friday, the buzz hadn't died down. In fact, it had grown. Elaine Carter, the janitor no one noticed, was now the name on everyone's lips. But unlike most high school gossip, this wasn't petty or fleeting. It wasn't scandal. It was something else. Something deeper. In the halls, students who used to walk right past her with their earbuds in now slowed their pace. Some even said, "Good morning, Miss Elaine," their voices tentative, unsure how to undo years of silence in a single sentence. She didn't hold it against them. She never had. In fact, Elaine hadn't changed at all. She still wore her same faded blue work shirt, still tied her gray-streaked hair up in a bun, still pushed her mop cart with the same quiet rhythm, humming softly under her breath. But the world around her was changing. Slowly, clumsily, but changing all the same. One morning, as she cleaned the windows outside the main office, a voice called out, "Miss Elaine." She turned to see Jordan Rivera, the same student who had asked Mr. Bennett who she really was. He stood awkwardly, holding a small notebook. I was wondering," he said, shifting on his feet, "would you mind looking over one of my calculus problems? I think I messed up the limits." Elaine blinked, then smiled. "Sure," she said, setting her spray bottle down. He handed her the notebook, and together they stood under the sunlight filtering through the glass, talking about derivatives and common mistakes, like it was the most natural thing in the world. More students followed. Jessica, the girl who once laughed the loudest, brought Elaine a cup of tea after lunch. "I didn't know how else to say sorry," she mumbled, cheeks red. Elaine accepted it with a quiet nod. Even the other teachers began to shift. A few started greeting her in the teacher's lounge, places she'd never felt welcome in before. Some asked how long she'd been with the school. Others simply said thank you when she cleaned their classrooms at the end of the day. And Mr. Bennett, he changed the most. Gone was the smugness, the performative intelligence. He started asking more questions than he answered. He talked less in the hallways and listened more in the lounge. And in his calculus class, he took a permanent marker and wrote on the whiteboard, "Never underestimate the quiet ones. Genius doesn't always come with a title." Underneath, in smaller letters, he wrote, "Dedicated to Miss Elaine Carter." The students stared at the quote for a long time. Some took photos. Others just looked at it, thoughtful and still. The moment felt different. For the first time in a long time, the school felt like it was breathing a new kind of air, one filled with awareness, with respect, with something, humility. Elaine noticed it all, but she didn't let it change her. She kept her head down, did her job, and moved through the halls with the same quiet grace she always had. But inside, deep inside, something had shifted. She, and maybe she never had been. They had just never learned how to see her. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Principal Harris knocked on the supply closet door. Elaine looked up from where she was organizing bottles of cleaner. She hadn't expected company, let alone from the man whose office she usually passed without a second glance. "Miss Carter," he said gently, almost as if he was stepping into a church. "Do you have a moment?" Elaine nodded, motioning him in. The space was small, and Harris, tall, broad-shouldered, always crisp in a navy blue suit, seemed almost too large for it. He looked around awkwardly, noticing the mop buckets, the hand-labeled drawers, the single fold-up chair in the corner. It didn't feel like a room where a conversation like this should happen, but he cleared his throat anyway and got straight to the point. "I've been hearing a lot," he said, folding his hands, "about what happened in Mr. Bennett's class. About you." Elaine didn't respond. She wasn't sure what kind of hearing a lot this was. Praise? Gossip? Damage control? Principal Harris looked at her seriously. "I'll admit something to you," he said. "I've been principal at this school for over 12 years, and in that time, I never once asked who you were beyond your title. I never thought to, and that's on me." Elaine tilted her head slightly. That was more honest than she'd expected. Harris took a breath, then continued. "I also learned something else. You were a math scholar. Carnegie Mellon, honors program. A published paper from 1982 in the American Journal of Theoretical Mathematics. That's no small thing." Elaine's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "That was a long time ago." "Maybe," he said, "but talent doesn't expire." He paused, searching her face before speaking again. "I'd like to offer you something. We have a mentorship program launching next semester, targeting underperforming students, especially those struggling in STEM. I want you to be part of it. Officially." Elaine blinked. "You mean teach?" "Not full-time," he said quickly, "unless you want that. But guest mentoring, tutoring, maybe even leading a workshop. We'll pay you for your time, you'll have full support, and most importantly, you'll have the platform to share what you know with students who need to see someone like you in front of that whiteboard." Elaine turned her gaze to the window, watching a few students walk across the quad. It was the kind of offer she had long buried in a box somewhere deep inside herself. One she had once dreamed of. But dreams fade over time. They shrink, they adapt, they grow quieter so life can grow louder. "I appreciate it," she said slowly. "Truly, but I've learned something these past few days." Principal Harris listened, eyebrows raised. "I don't need a title to prove my worth," Elaine continued. "The respect I've earned here, it came because I stood up for myself. Not because anyone gave me a different uniform." He nodded. "That's fair. But," she added with a half-smile, "I'm not saying no." Harris laughed softly, surprised. Elaine's voice was steady. "I don't want to be the janitor who used to be smart. I want to help in a way that matters. If that means sitting with one kid after school, showing them what I know, then I'll do that. I'll have our coordinator reach out," Harris said, smiling. "No pressure, just thank you, Miss Carter." As he turned to leave, Elaine called out gently, "Principal Harris?" He looked back. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me." He nodded, quietly moved, and stepped out into the hallway. Elaine stood for a moment in the stillness, her reflection faint in the supply closet mirror. And for the first time in a long, long while, she didn't just see herself as a woman who had given something up. She saw a woman who had given something back and was just getting started. 2 weeks later, Elaine Carter found herself seated at a desk, not with a mop in hand, but with a dry erase marker and a small stack of student folders. The school had cleared out a corner in the library for the mentorship program. It wasn't anything fancy, just 2 chairs, a whiteboard, and a bookshelf filled with dusty math textbooks no one had touched in years. But to Elaine, it felt like coming home. Her first student was a sophomore named Marcus Green. He was 15, wiry, with a permanent hoodie over his head and eyes that rarely met anyone else's. He'd been flagged for the program after nearly failing Algebra 2. Quiet in class, rarely turned in homework, but according to his math teacher, he's not lazy, there's something there, he just hides it. Elaine recognized that look the moment she saw him. She had worn it once herself, back when teachers assumed she was slow simply because she didn't speak up, back when her mind was racing with numbers, but her voice had been silenced by the fear of being wrong, or worse, dismissed. "Hey there," she said gently, nodding toward the empty seat beside her. Marcus shrugged and sat down, pulling his backpack into his lap like a shield. "Know why you're here?" she asked. "Because I suck at math," he muttered, eyes fixed on the floor. Elaine chuckled lightly. "I don't believe that for a second." He looked up, confused. "People who suck at math don't get that angry about it," she continued. "They don't care enough. You do. That means there's something worth digging into." Marcus blinked. No one had said that to him before. Elaine handed him a marker and pointed to the whiteboard. "Show me what part gives you trouble. No pressure, no grades, just you and me." The first few sessions were rocky. Marcus barely spoke above a whisper. He'd shake his head when asked a question and mutter, "I don't know," even when he did. But Elaine didn't rush him. She didn't correct him with sharpness or frustration. She just sat with him, waited, let the silence do its work. And slowly, something shifted. By the 4th session, Marcus picked up the marker without being asked. By the 6th, he cracked a joke, dry, quick, but funny. By the 8th, he solved a quadratic equation entirely on his own. "You just needed someone to believe you could," Elaine told him. Marcus stared at the board, then down at his hands. "You're not just smart, Marcus," she said. "You're sharp. You think differently. That's not a weakness. That's a superpower." He smiled, just a little. Word spread quickly. More students started showing up during lunch. Some came to ask about math, some just came to sit near her and listen. She didn't make it about her. She never told them about her past unless they asked. But when they did, when someone finally said, "Wait, you went to Carnegie Mellon?" she'd simply nod and say, "Once, a long time ago. I had to walk away, but not from the love of numbers." What started as a mentorship program became something bigger, a space, a safe place, a corner of the school where students felt seen, not for what they wore or what they scored on a test, but for who they were becoming. And the heart of it all was a woman who once believed her time had passed. But now, day by day, student by student, Elaine Carter was building something far more powerful than equations. She was building belief. Spring rolled in with warmer days and blooming cherry blossoms outside the school windows. But inside, tension was building. The school had just announced its annual STEM Showcase Night, a big event where top students presented projects, led workshops, and demonstrated experiments for the entire school community. Parents came. News cameras sometimes showed up. It was a big deal. Mr. Bennett, now the reluctant champion of change, approached Elaine one afternoon as she was wiping down the tables in the math lab. "I want Marcus to present at the showcase," he said. "A math demo, something simple but smart, something he can own." Elaine froze mid-wipe. "Marcus?" Bennett nodded. He's ready. I've seen the progress. He just needs a push. She stared at the cloth in her hand, thinking. Marcus had come a long way, more than anyone had expected. But she also knew the look in his eyes whenever too many people stared at him, the way his shoulders curled inward like he wanted to disappear. The wrong moment, the wrong comment, and all that progress could crumble. I'll talk to him, she said quietly. That evening, in their usual corner of the library, Elaine brought it up. Marcus stiffened immediately. No way. Why not? Because people will laugh or say I'm not supposed to be up there. You know how it is. Elaine nodded. Oh, she knew. She had once been that kid. Talented but terrified. Smart but silenced. And she remembered the moment she walked away from a dream, not because she wasn't capable, but because she believed the lie that she didn't belong. She wouldn't let him believe the same. So she leaned forward, her voice low but firm. Marcus, when you stand in front of that room, you're not just doing it for you. You're doing it for every kid who thinks they're not good enough. Every kid who hides their hand when they know the answer. He swallowed hard. You can be the reason someone starts to believe in themselves. Marcus looked down quiet. Then, after a long pause, he said, Only if you go up there with me. Elaine blinked. What? I'm not doing it alone, he said. You've been with me since day one. If I'm going to stand in front of all those people, I want you there. She hesitated. It had been years, decades, since she stood in front of a room like that. Not as a cleaner, not as someone in the background, but as someone center stage. She felt the familiar knot in her stomach, but this time it came with something else. Conviction. She smiled. Okay, she said, let's do it together. The night of the showcase, the school auditorium was packed. Lights were bright, cameras ready, voices buzzing across the room. And then the MC stepped up to the mic. Our next presenters are two people who've taught us that brilliance can come from anywhere, and that sometimes the quietest voices carry the greatest power. Please welcome Marcus Green and Miss Elaine Carter. Applause broke out. Polite at first, then louder when students recognized her name. Elaine stepped onto the stage slowly, beside Marcus. He gripped his notes tightly, and she gave him a nod of reassurance. Then together they began. They walked the crowd through a clever math concept, how patterns in music relate to sequences in algebra. Marcus handled the opening, Elaine guided the flow. They spoke like a team, like they belonged there because they did. And when they finished, the room didn't just clap, they stood. A standing ovation, students, teachers, parents, even Principal Harris, who wiped a tear from his eye. Elaine looked out across the crowd, blinking beneath the lights. It wasn't fear she felt, it wasn't even pride, it was peace. Because this time, she wasn't alone. And this time, she hadn't just changed her own story, she'd helped rewrite someone else's. It didn't take long for the video to spread. A parent had recorded Marcus and Elaine's STEM presentation and posted it online that same night with the caption, "The janitor and the sophomore who stunned us all." By morning, it had over 10,000 views. By the end of the week, half the town had watched it, along with neighboring districts, a few local news outlets, and more than a few educators who now found themselves wondering, how many Elaine Carters have we overlooked? Westbrook High became the center of attention, not for a scandal, but for a story of redemption, resilience, and something rare in education these days: authentic inspiration. Principal Harris knocked on her supply room door again the following Monday. "I swear, I'm not making a habit out of this," he joked as he stepped in. This time, he brought coffee. Elaine smiled. "I'm starting to think this closet has better office hours than the main building." They laughed, and then Harris got to the point. "We've been asked to participate in the upcoming Tri-County Education Summit next month," he said. "They want us to send a speaker who represents innovation and equity in education." Elaine raised an eyebrow. "Us? They asked for you," he said. "By name." Elaine blinked. "Why would they want to hear from me? I'm not an administrator." "You're more than that," Harris said. "You're proof of what happens when we actually see people, when we stop judging someone's value by their title, age, or job description. You changed this school." She was quiet. She didn't seek the spotlight, she never had. But something had shifted in her after that night on stage with Marcus. Standing beside him, watching his shoulders straighten and his voice carry across the room, that had lit a fire she hadn't felt in 30 years. Maybe it was time. "All right," she said softly. "I'll go, but only if I can tell it my way." Principal Harris smiled. That's exactly what they're hoping for. The auditorium at the Education Summit was larger than anything Elaine had stepped into before. Hundreds of teachers, principals, counselors, and parents filled the seats, programs in hand, expecting another keynote. But when Elaine Carter stepped onto the stage in her simple gray cardigan and low heels, holding nothing but a folded sheet of paper, the room fell silent. "I'm not a speaker," she began, her voice calm and sure. "I'm not a CEO. I'm not a published author. I don't have letters after my name anymore. But what I do have is a story." And she told it. About Carnegie Mellon. A week after the summit, the emails started coming in. Some were from school districts across the state, asking if Elaine would be willing to speak at their diversity panels or mentorship events. Others were from teachers who wanted to start similar programs at their own schools. One came from a young black woman in Georgia who simply wrote, "You made me believe I still have time." "Thank you," Elaine read every message. Some made her smile. Some made her cry. She had never imagined that telling her truth could travel this far. That a story born in a quiet supply closet, told in front of some folding chairs and a whiteboard, could ripple outward and stir so many lives. But even with the growing attention, Elaine stayed grounded. She still arrived at Westbrook High before sunrise, still swept the halls, still cleaned up the cafeteria after lunch, and still met with Marcus, and now 3 other students, every week in the library, tutoring them with the same patience, the same grace. One afternoon, as she helped a freshman girl named Nia work through a geometry problem, Principal Harris knocked softly on the library door. "Got a minute?" he asked. Elaine looked up. "Sure." He stepped in and handed her a manila folder. "The superintendent's office has been watching what's happening here. They're impressed. By you, by Marcus, by what this school is becoming, and they want to do something bigger." Elaine opened the folder slowly. Inside was a proposal. The Carter Fellowship, a district-wide initiative to identify under-recognized talent among school support staff. The program would offer training, part-time academic roles, and a clear path for those with untapped teaching potential to step forward and lead. "They want to name it after me?" she asked, stunned. "They do," Harris said, "because you proved that knowledge and leadership don't come from a title or a desk. They come from showing up, from lifting others, from never giving up on what's inside you." Elaine didn't speak for a long time. She looked out the window, where the late afternoon sun poured golden light across the quad. A group of students passed by, and a few of them waved when they saw her. She waved back. Then, almost to herself, she said, "I thought I was just cleaning up after kids. Turns out I was still planting seeds." By the end of the school year, the Carter Fellowship was launched in 3 schools. The year after that, it expanded to 20. Former cafeteria workers, bus drivers, teacher aides, and yes, janitors, were stepping into new roles, offering skills and stories, and strength that had long gone unnoticed. Students, in turn, began seeing role models in places they'd never thought to look. At Westbrook, a new plaque was installed just outside the library. The Carter Learning Corner, in honor of Miss Elaine Carter, whose quiet voice changed us all. Elaine didn't want a statue. She didn't care for fame, but she stood there quietly one afternoon, running her fingers over the engraved letters, and felt something she hadn't known she was missing for a very long time. Closure. Not the kind that ends a story, but the kind that completes one. The kind that says, "You mattered. You still do. And now others will too." The seasons passed, quietly, gently. Years moved like wind through the corridors of Westbrook High. Faces changed, principals retired, new teachers arrived, students graduated, moved on, returned to visit with taller frames and stories of college or careers. And Elaine Carter, she remained. Not as the school janitor anymore. She had retired from that role 2 years ago, but as something far more lasting. She still came in once a week, not to clean, but to mentor. She sat at the same corner in the library, now called the Carter Learning Corner, helping students not just with math, but with self-belief. Sometimes she said a lot. Other times she simply listened, and the room always felt warmer when she was there. One crisp autumn afternoon, as golden leaves danced outside the windows, Elaine sat by the library window, a thick cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, her hair now fully silver. Across from her sat Ava Nguyen, a bright 10th grader with an anxious energy and a notebook full of calculus questions. Elaine smiled at her, gently tapping the page. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." Ava laughed nervously. "That's kind of my thing." Elaine leaned back. "You remind me of someone." "Who?" Elaine's smile deepened. "Me, 40 years ago." Ava looked surprised. "Really?" "Oh, yes," she said, terrified of speaking up, full of answers but too scared of being wrong. "But once I found someone who believed in me, I stopped hiding, started showing up as who I really was." Ava looked at her differently after that, not just as a tutor, but as a mirror. That evening, Elaine stayed a little longer than usual. She walked the halls slowly, fingers grazing the lockers, the bulletin boards, the fading posters taped to classroom doors. So much had changed, yet so much still felt the same. She paused outside the math wing, where a new teacher was leading a group of students through a tricky equation. The teacher was Marcus Green, now in his late 20s, fresh from a master's degree in education, and a full-time faculty member at the very school that once almost lost him. Elaine watched him for a moment, proud. He didn't notice her standing there, but one of the students did. "That's Miss Carter," the boy whispered. Another leaned closer. "She's the reason Mr. Green teaches here." Elaine turned away with a soft smile, letting their words settle in the silence of the hallway. That night, she sat in her small apartment, sipping tea by the window. The city lights blinked softly in the distance. On the table beside her was a stack of letters, from former students, teachers, even strangers from other states, people whose lives had been touched by the Carter Fellowship or by her quiet courage. She picked one up, reread it. "You changed my life without ever raising your voice. You taught me that I mattered, that I was seen." Elaine closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in. Not long ago she had believed her light had faded, that her moment had passed, but she had learned, maybe the most important lesson of all, that some flames don't burn loud. They burn steady, they burn quiet, and they light the way for others. The next morning, when she returned to Westbrook, the students greeted her as they always did, smiling, waving, calling out, "Hey, Miss Carter," as they passed. She didn't need applause. She didn't need recognition, because she had already left something behind that would outlast them all. A legacy of light, of dignity, of belief. Life lesson. Greatness doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. In a world that often worships titles, applause, and shiny resumes, Elaine Carter reminds us of something quietly profound. True greatness doesn't always stand in the spotlight. Sometimes it's mopping the floor in silence, solving equations no one believes you can, and lifting others up even when the world keeps pushing you down. Elaine spent decades unseen, not because she lacked brilliance, but because people never bothered to look deeper. They saw a janitor, an older black woman, someone to be ignored, or worse, laughed at. But her mind was never dull. Her heart was never bitter. And when the moment came, she didn't rise out of pride. She rose because someone needed her. She rose because silence had gone on too long. And in rising, she didn't just reclaim her own worth, she ignited it in others, in Marcus, in Avenue, in every quiet kid too afraid to raise their hand, in every overlooked worker who wondered if their story still mattered. Her story teaches us that you are never too old to be seen, never too small to make an impact, and never too late to rise. Because sometimes the loudest revolution doesn't begin with a shout. It begins with a whisper of chalk on a board, a mop placed gently against the wall, a decision to say, "Not today. Today I will show you who I am." So here's the truth. You don't need permission to be brilliant. You don't need a podium to be powerful. You don't need a title to matter. You just need to believe. First in yourself, and then in the ones no one else sees yet. Elaine Carter believed. And because of that, the world changed.